I first came to Corporate Jet Investor in 2011. I think it was the first Corporate Jet Investor. And I can't imagine, if I went back in time, that I'd be sitting here one day discussing, in all seriousness, potentiality of banning private aviation. It's quite a shift in mentality. Here we have our protesters who were here yesterday who seem to want to ban not just private jets, but abolish billionaires. I'm not quite sure how you achieve that, and that would be an interesting discussion all by itself. But this is clearly the sort of the vibe that we have in business aviation these days. So Al's asked the question, can a country ban private aviation? And there's a lot to unpack in that question, and we have a fantastic panel to do that, which I'll introduce in a second. But there's so many spin-off questions just in that one question. Could a country ban private aviation? Well, can it legally? Will it? Should it? A country, what countries are we talking about? We're talking EU, UK, we're talking the rest of the world. I think it's a largely EU, UK panel, and there's no apologies for that, because I think, as we'll find out during the session, this is a largely EU, UK issue. In fact, delegates from the rest of the world must feel that they're in some sort of alternative reality that this even comes up as a discussion. And a ban, are we talking outright ban? Are we talking measures implemented which have the same effects as an outright ban? Taxes, slot constraint, those sorts of restrictions. But we'll try and end on a very positive note. We'll try and be optimistic. The Seafield Group discussion this morning was very interesting. The research that was summarized this morning, even that said the number one issue across the industry that people are most fearful of is government policy and taxation. So that was interesting. It was also then quite interesting that only 23% of the people who said that, only 23% of people said that, which we thought was quite a low number. But again, another of the points on that, from that research, was to engage with policymakers, to engage with politicians. And we'll try and end the session today on a much more optimistic, positive note about how to do that and what we can do ourselves to change the narrative on business aviation and to engage with policymakers. So, sorry, that was a long preamble before introducing the panel. We have the slide question, could you see a country banning private jets? Quite interesting answer so far, yes, possibly 100%. Maybe only one person's answered the question. Two. So somebody can balance that out in a second. But to introduce the panel, on the far side, Stephen Truxell, a good friend, Stephen's Professor of Air and Space Law at the prestigious Institute of Air and Space Law at Leiden University. Dave Edwards, who's well known to us all, Chief Executive of the Royal Aeronautical Society, and Lindsay Oliver, who will again be all very well known to us all, Managing Director of the BBGA, British Business and General Aviation Association. So I think, Stephen, if we could start with you sort of directly addressing the question that Al's asked, can legally a country really ban private aviation?
As you've said, Mark, in your introduction, it is a complicated answer. I'll try to summarize, but just to say, my home airport, Amsterdam Schiphol Airport, plans have already been announced to ban business jets from next year as part of a wider strategy to curb noise and CO2 emissions. And 2 years ago, you may remember that both the Netherlands and France called on the EU to implement stricter regulations on business jets, again, because arguing that the environmental impact is disproportionate. So within the EU, a national ban by a state would need to align with the wider single European aviation market principles and their competing interests. So member states would need to ensure non-discrimination and proportionality. So if a ban disproportionately affects, let's say, operators from other EU countries, then it may be challenged. And while environmental measures are allowed, in principle, they must be evidence-based, and they have to comply with EU rules on freedom of movement and services. So stay tuned on the EU. If we zoom out, states are sovereign, and they can impose restrictions or bans so long as they don't violate their international law obligations. So they have to follow the international treaty, of course, the Chicago Convention from 1944, celebrating 80 years this year, and ICAO standards. So, for instance, a state is allowed to regulate aircraft in its territory, but those rules have to apply uniformly to all aircraft, so regardless of nationality. So a selective ban, let's say, on foreign business jets only would breach ICAO principles and Article 11 of the Convention. And in general, states must avoid measures that discriminate unjustly or create, quote, unnecessary obstacles to international civil aviation. So you may be able to use Article 44 of the Convention as well. The last point is really, if we do in law make a distinction between scheduled and non-scheduled international air services. The scheduled services like British Airways, the commercial services, those airlines derive rights from bilateral and multilateral air services agreements negotiated by states on behalf of airlines. So they get the traffic rights through those. And many of those regulate access to airspace and airports. So a blanket ban on business jets by one state might contravene its obligations under those agreements and lead to disputes and so on. The latter, the non-scheduled services, so including business jets more generally, don't require those same traffic rights through those agreements. So that's a little interesting.
I'm very interested from, you sort of take a sort of more independent view on business aviation than most people in this room whose jobs rely upon business aviation. So how and also you're very close to Brussels in the work that you do. How is business aviation viewed from the Netherlands, from Brussels, from somebody who's slightly outside the industry?
Well, first of all, I know you, Mark, here, and you invited me to come, but otherwise I look out into the audience and it's a very strange thing to come to a conference and not recognize anyone. It's very nice to meet you all. But I am, in a sense, an outsider, and in the Netherlands, I tend to tell people that in the Netherlands, aviation, full stop, is not a topic which you raise at the dinner table, because you're likely to get into an argument. Let that just sink in a little bit. I know people in the room, you're working in aviation, you're living and breathing this, right? And I am to an extent as well, but from an academic chair. There's a toxic feeling, right? There's a toxic mood, certainly within the Netherlands, about aviation. We've seen this through the slot reductions. I mean, I tend to say in many parts of the world, airports are being built, they're expanding, and in the Netherlands and other places in Europe, Dublin is another good example, there's looking to shrink airports for environmental reasons. So, there's a lot of the negative thing, the kind of maybe Taylor Swift, maybe she's a little more popular, but the wealthy and privileged using business jets. And there's less of that understanding, I think, from the general public, and you all know this better than me, about the economic contribution. I mean, the deals are being made for vaccines or for clothing or for defense, guarding the borders like in the previous panel. So I think that's kind of missing a little bit. And I think that the last thing I'll say is, our university policy is that we have to take a train if we can reach a place within 6 hours by train. And the Dutch government's policy is 8 hours by train. So I'm not allowed to fly to London and back, even though it's much, much cheaper. And the university, of course, says, good, it's more expensive, then you will travel less.
It's always ironic that the professor of air law in Leiden can't travel by aviation for a certain distance. Though France, of course, has a ban on traveling, as far as I understand, for more than if there's a train alternative that gets you in your destination in less than 2.5 hours. So.
Yeah, well, we have this general ban in France, and Spain is planning the same. Of course, there are, this is possible under, this is the nerdy bit, Article 20 of Regulation 1008/2008, which is the air services regulation. So it's possible, this is a regulation of 2008, but only, 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, France used this provision within the treaty by way of the European Commission to get their approval. It was the first time that it was used. And so, of course, other states within the EU are looking at that saying, oh, perhaps we could also, where we have a substitute available, so high-speed trains are a good substitute for flights, of course, within a state. So where that is available, then a state can, with the approval of the Commission, temporarily ban within their territory flights of certain distances. And other states like Switzerland has, brought in rather, restrictions on the emission standards. So certain aircraft that don't meet the emission standards are then banned. So there are those ways of doing it, and we already talked about slots. So of course, there's a prioritization of commercial flights over business jets at some congested airports. So you could do it through the airport slots. And maybe some states might just out of equity and fairness, social fairness, then want to do this. But we don't have it yet.
Talking about dinner parties, I definitely don't ever at a dinner party say that I'm a lawyer who acts for banks which finance private jets. This doesn't get you very far. Dave, I think lots of people at the conference, sort of knowing that this session was coming up to me and saying, this can't be serious. You're not seriously talking about banning privatization. We're not seriously talking about countries banning private aircraft. But I think you when we were chatting earlier, you seem to think that this could be a realistic possibility in some countries.
I love the fact that you're coming to me to be positive. I mean, that's usually the grumpy one. I think probably just need to be realistic, and I'll mash it all together in an education piece. For those of you who haven't met me, 25 years, unbelievably, in business aviation, now running a 159-year-old society, which was formed 34 years before the Wright brothers went flying. So we've kind of been around for quite a long time. I spend in this role an awful lot of time with governments across the world, obviously a lot with the UK government. And I will get into an argument at a dinner party about why this sector doesn't promote itself better and be proud of what you do and how you achieve it. And there's always that fear factor, I think, that we all sort of, have. We kind of, laughing at the protesters yesterday because we all, think they don't have a point. But sadly, they do have a point to the outside world, outside of this room. And they do have a point to the next generations coming behind them. I hope you're not leaving because of my words already. But the challenge that I'll put to all of you really is the education piece that you've got to take to government to just get into their heads about the impact of business aviation, or if you pay attention to politics in the way that I do, private aviation, as you'll see out of the current UK government. Nobody in UK government, I think it's fairly open to say, we'll talk about anything other than private aviation. Just wording, it counts for a lot of things. And so the task that I would kind of throw to all of you at your dinner parties is just make sure the world understands what business aviation does and its merits. Perhaps don't fall into the traps that I occasionally see and was probably guilty of in the old days of talking about air ambulances, those kind of things, to sort of try and divert attention from the core reason why business aviation is there, which is ultimately to generate growth, which is, a key line for government at the moment. So I think lots of things to take in there, but just that the messaging bit for your sector, my sector in the old days, is really important. And you've got to make sure that you're educating at every government level that you possibly can, from your local town councillors through to your county councillors and equivalents, through to government at the very highest level. Whatever opportunity you've got to just get through all of the myths, because otherwise at some point you will be dealing with TikTok. And I can't remember who showed it me earlier, but the picture on the front page of the Daily Telegraph today was of somebody around this establishment launching, if I'm not talking out of turn here, a punch at one of the protesters yesterday, wrestling with one of the protesters. You look at the picture, make your own mind up. We all know the other argument, but the outside world reading the Telegraph today has seen a fight at a business aviation conference. And that's the messaging we will all have to deal with and rally up against in due course. I would think it's not going away as much as probably most of us would like to think it might be.
Thanks, Dave. The question
wasn't
before
very
this,
positive at the end, I guarantee.
we'll be positive later. The question before the last question was interesting because I think that was, do people think there will be an outright ban somewhere on private jets? And the answer was, I was quite surprised by that answer because I expected people to mostly vote no. And yet 70% of people voted yes. So I find that quite surprising. But also of interest is the contrast with the next question on the slide there, which is, do you think there'll be restrictions? And the answer to that was 100%, which leads me on to the discussion with Lindsay on what some of those restrictions might be, especially in the UK. Stephen's already touched on constraints on allocating slots, environmental measures, EU ETS, CORSIA, etc. But I think we'd like to move the discussion on to passenger taxes and what the UK is doing in respect to passenger taxes and what BBGA is responding by saying.
Yes, APD, what an interesting subject that is. But it is the most recent piece of headline that we've had about the industry and how taxation is burdening us, but there are many more. And I think from a UK Trade Association's perspective, this is our bread and butter. This is what we do. We respond to consultation, we get industry's views on this, and we put this submission in. APD higher rate bans, this was dropped. There was two elements to this. On the 30th of October 2024, the day of the budget, so Rachel Reeves announced that the higher rate band of APD was going to increase by 50%. That's happened, that's done, that comes into effect in 2026. What happened later in the day was that the new consultation to incorporate a change in the weight banding of APD for business aviation, they call it private jets, we don't recognise that term private jets, we only recognise business aviation, would change from 5.7 to 20 tonnes, and the consultation for that dropped the day of the budget, so the 30th of October. The closing date for that consultation was the 22nd of January. I don't know how your organisations work, but it's very difficult to find a whole month of December to consult with your industry on this to get their views. So we had a lot of work to do in that month of November and then in the first couple of weeks of January to put an industry response in for APD. We managed to squeeze a meeting in December with the Treasury and HMRC. And I say we, as the royal we, because it wasn't just BBGA. This was a joint industry piece of work with the Air Charter Association and with the Regional Business Airports Group, both with very loud voices, both with memberships of very strong views. So we went in there as a combined industry voice, if you will. So the Treasury meeting in London was quite insightful. We asked them a lot of questions, they asked us a lot of questions, but we were met with the APD Treasury team. So this is the government department that are looking after taxation revenue into the Treasury.
They're the people you want at your dinner party.
Yeah. I say that with a tongue in my cheek because they're only interested in revenue. They're not interested on whether this is particularly based at aviation. This is a taxation on how they can generate money. Then we were also met with a team from HMRC who were looking at the mechanics of collecting that money. How would they do it? Is it efficient? Can we get it done better? And then, of course, we had our aviation DFT team there. So that was a really good session where we could understand how our response would be received in the best way. The next stage of that piece of work, bear in mind we have 2 weeks of Christmas in the middle of this, is to join together and start to think about our answers. So just before we did that, we invited Treasury, DFT and HMRC on a hold-your-hand tour of a business aviation environment. And we're talking in a moment about perception and how do we give ourselves a better image of our industry. And I'm a strong believer, we are a really strong believer in taking policymakers by the hand to an FBO, to an aircraft, to a service station, and actually showing them what that actually means in real life. This isn't a Zoom call, this isn't an email, this is taking them by the hand to that environment. And we did that. We took them to Biggin Hill. They went to an FBO, they went to the service centre at Bombardier, they had a long tour. And there was a good number of them. Looking at IFA, there was 9 or 10 of the delegation there. We put them on a citation. We crammed them on there, and we showed them that this isn't Emirates first class high rate APD travel. This is a taxation on business aviation, regardless of how you think this is going to be a luxury form of travel, this is not. Now, following that meeting, we sort of left the meeting thinking that this was a good demonstration of how the industry works. We showed them jobs, we showed them growth, we showed them the importance of the industry. We then had to write our response to that consultation in the questions that were given. Now, if you've read the consultation questions, I urge you to read them 3 or 4 times before you calm down and then answer the questions, because some of the questions are really quite bizarre. But we answer the questions with a view that the revenue generated potentially from this consultation, so changing the bandwidth from 5.7 to 20 tonnes, all of those aircraft will be impacted at a higher rate of APD. The amount of money that you would collect from that is de minimis to what it would cost to actually collect that money. That was the position that we took. And out of that, the paper that the questions, the answers to the questions in the consultation, we feel is quite a reasonable industry lobbying piece. We've shared that with members. I'm more than happy to share that again with you. But just to give you an idea of timescale, we asked Treasury this. The APD at the higher rate that's already been agreed, as I said, that 50% increase comes in at 2026. The consultation that we have responded to will be looked at currently. We're expecting an answer sometime in the second half of this year. They have confirmed that if they decide to go ahead with this, it would be confirmed in a budgetary announcement in 2027 to take effect from 2028. So this could be bad news, but it won't be happening till probably 2028 if it does happen.
Thanks, Lindsay. Just a few points and questions on the Slido. Next year, why don't we do a reverse process and hold signs up with coal power plants in China? And ask anti-plane protesters what's the solution for those. I think that leads me to the thought that maybe one for Dave, which is, when people are protesting, are they? Is it an environmental protest, or are they trying to raise? Is government trying to raise funds, or do they just dislike rich people?
I'm not sure I'm going to exactly answer that one. You can judge for yourselves, can't you, from the protests of yesterday, whether it was specifically about business jets or whether it was about, I'm not sure I saw, I'm going to say kill the billionaires. I'm not sure it was kill the billionaires, but it was rid us of the billionaires. Maybe that's a different argument to the business jet sort of things. What was the first question? Sorry, I was trying to think of my political answer.
Is it really
losing my job?
I guess the bottom line is it really an environmental thing, or is it a dislike of wealthy people? Do you think if business aviation was totally net zero, do you think people would still protest because they just don't like wealthy people flying in luxury jets? Bottom line.
I don't think anybody would say there will be people who don't like people with wealth, full stop. So that perhaps is an argument. In terms of should we retaliate and go to China and coal-powered fire stations in China, I don't think that's really going to help necessarily. But coming back to the basic bit of explain what you do, explain what the sector does, engage better, so that, because you're always going to have people who, right, okay, ban billionaires campaign, well, that will be something to do. I'm not sure private aviation or business aviation is the root cause of the ban billionaires campaign, but thank you. It just comes back to the same messaging piece. People don't understand. For years and years and years, if ever any of you have been approached by media companies to do a TV show or a newspaper article on private business aviation, like there's no hunger from inside the sector to really do it, because everybody's a little bit shy and reticent. Obviously, go to the other side of the pond. Business aviation just has a totally different perception over there, but over here particularly, we can't get people to go and put their hands up really and say, yeah, this is why we do it, because that probably does play into the Ban Billionaires campaign a bit more. So it's that messaging piece. It's just more explanations, so that when a public protest gets into the places in power that make the decisions about access to airports or increased taxation, that they know the balanced side of the argument. They understand that, the impact that business aviation actually has. And that's kind of the role of the associations, I guess, and me in my meetings to just remind, government how it's part of the growth thing that government's looking for.
But I mean, Stephen, from the sort of outsider looking in perspective, are we wasting our time in trying to change the narrative on business aviation?
No, I don't think so. I agree with these points about education. I spoke at an EBAA summit 2 years ago or something, and I remember being a little alarmed that the location was not shared, really not shared, and there was no protest. It was in Brussels. That kind of sunk in for me. That was a kind of a wake-up call for me, I suppose, a little bit about what you're dealing with in terms of the outside world. How to change that, I think that's a £1 million question, how exactly to do that. But of course, the associations are making steps. We, through education, of course, at universities also are getting people to think with a more open mind and understand supply chains and understand how things work in the economy. I tend to say also that, and I know there's a comment about the Netherlands, but I think the Netherlands is the biggest consumer of avocados per capita. Avocados are extremely water intensive and they don't grow anywhere near the Netherlands. So I tend to bring that up if somebody says something to me about how is it possible that we can have at a university in the Netherlands a professor of air and space law. They're both horrible for the environment.
Is that your dinner party reply?
No. I don't try not to invite those people to dinner, but
Don't serve avocados.
No, but it is a fight. It is a I think a struggle to get people to think, educated people to think about where their avocado comes from.
There's a legitimate good point on the slide there, which is that there may be restrictions at large airports, but it's an opportunity for regional airports. I mean, Dave, that's just completely true, isn't it? That if restrictions at Schiphol raises the opportunity for other airports to offer service to business jets.
Yeah, it's what business aviation does anyway, isn't it? Nobody really wants to go to Heathrow too much at the moment because you're going to spend as much time in the car as you did in the actual aircraft itself. So, yeah, it creates loads of opportunity around the houses. I don't know, was that my question or yours?
No, it was yours. But I was going to add something if you finish. But the problem is SAF, right? I mean, the SAF is not or may not be available at these regional airports. So there's a problem with that.
That's a good point. Well, there's book and claim.
There's book and claim. There are other problems. But
and those are the kind of things that we talk about book and claim as if we're experts on book and claim, and it's a line that I hear quite a lot. Book and claim. But, again,
there's nothing about book and claim. I just threw it in there because...
Yeah, precisely. So we're then, you potentially walking into yet another trap. I would just come back to there's probably no point in arguing with the vocal minority. I remember last year, as a few of us did, there was a protest outside CJI, and I decided to go and have a chat with them because this is my job, and I'm supposed to engage with the whole world about aerospace. And the discussion was entirely on perception of what business aviation was. The question, I said, just give me a statement, something. And the lady, who was a former civil servant who lived in Farnborough, said that every aircraft taking off from Farnborough on a weekend was going golfing at Gleneagles. And I went, well, that's not true, because I worked there for 12 years, I think. No, it is true. And I said, no, genuinely, it's not. I mean, yeah, some people go golfing, I'll admit, but it's not true. And she goes, no, it is. And then you turn to her colleague and say, okay, just give me one more fact. And it's the line that I shouldn't laugh at, but she just went, I can't give you facts. They make me too emotional. I've used that every day in work since, I have to admit. But when you get to that point, you think, we're never going to win an argument on the basis of the people who had time to come and hold the hotel to ransom yesterday morning. But that's when getting the message out to most people are reasonable. Most people will listen to your arguments. Most people will want to learn. So go for the 98% in the middle who actually do want to learn and be educated and focus on them.
I mean, it's very true that they're not all going to golf at Gleneagles, because they do go to golf at other places on some. Lindsay, from the BBGA perspective, just to tell us what BBGA is doing at the moment to change the narrative to engage young people as well, because I think if we get young people in the industry who are positive about visitation, they tell their friends, etc., and that all helps.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a topic of conversation at BBGA for several years, not just on the perception, but also trying to get new people into industry to work. We need a new workforce. We need managerial workforce, but we need hand skills as well. And we have to get those young people engaged from a very young age. And in fact, the work of the Royal Aerosoc combines beautifully with the work of BBGA, where we take children from school age, primary school age, right the way through a university's outreach program that we've been doing for 3 years now at master's level students. So we're trying to capture all of those brains, all of those new people into industry. But coming back to the perception point, hopefully most people in the room would have heard or have seen our Did You Know campaign. So we ran a series of 20 videos, very short videos across social media platforms aimed at the general public. This is not aimed at you. So you're not the demographic that we were looking for. We are aiming at the general public. And we were really pleasantly surprised at the level of engagement with those videos when you look at which platforms were the most successful. And the one that was most successful by a long way was TikTok. And that is a demographic of young people who don't know anything about us watching our videos. And I think we've got one to show you now, just to give you an idea of what they look like. If you haven't already seen one, hopefully you already have. Can I say Run VT, or is that too cheesy?
You probably need to explain what TikTok is.
This industry supports millions of jobs worldwide, from pilots and engineers to service providers, boosting local economies. On top of that, business aviation is leading the way towards sustainability through cutting-edge technology. Innovations like winglets improve fuel efficiency. New technology propulsion systems are leading us towards a greener future. Hydrogen-powered aircraft could reduce emissions by up to 75%. We're serious about our net zero commitment, supporting initiatives that will accelerate our journey towards a sustainable future. If you want to learn more about business aviation, then be sure to follow us.
I think TikTok is very true. I mean, certainly the juniors at work or my own children, follow Steve Vassano's TikTok videos, and their perception has changed because of those videos. It does
They're really
work.
powerful. They're absolutely the key, I think, to engaging with a particular area of our of our young people that we want to get engaged and work with us and not against us.
And Dave, we've only got a couple of minutes, but the Royal Aeronautical Society, what's the society doing in terms of engaging young people?
So we get to 9,500 kids every year. At this point, I usually get a round of applause from my audience. Don't need it now because there's 800,000 kids in every school year in the UK. So whilst it's a brilliant number for us, I would love us to be able to get in front of all of the kids in the UK in a much more visceral way to hook them in. I spend quite more time than I would ever want to have done talking to influencers. But it's really quite a fascinating world because I go to a lot of meetings where we talk about how to find that next generation. Invariably, the average age of the people in the meeting is 35 plus, and the people who actually know how to get to kids today are probably 18 maximum. So that's where we're focusing a lot more at the moment. There is, just out of interest, how many people have heard of Roblox? Roblox. Yeah, so Roblox is something I'd never heard of. Roblox has come over the past 3 years into being a game that 89.4 million kids play with every single day. The average amount of time they spend on it is 2 hours. And it's an educational tool with loads of bad side to it as well. But I'm fascinated about, if I go to one more school, I could have just set up a metaverse, if that's the right word, on Roblox, and got to potentially 90 million kids in the first day. And I think the conversation we're having at the Society is, do we just carry on going to schools and hoping that's the way forward? Or do we just make sure that we're in front of kids when they're in their time off away from school? Because not every kid likes school. So we're doing lots of different things, lots of different research work with universities as well to actually understand how kids think.
Well, that's great. Alan's very keen on yes/no questions, so I think let's just quickly end with a quick yes/no question. So I think, Stephen, in 5 years' time, are we still going to have protesters outside Corporate Jet Investor? Yes/no?
Yes.
Yes.
No.
Well, there's a glimpse of optimism in the two no's, so that's fantastic. Thanks very much for the panel. I think it's a really interesting debate. I think this is an issue that is going to be with us. We need to keep campaigning. We need to keep fighting. We need to keep engaging with policymakers, and we need to change the narrative. And I'd throw in a yes, maybe, because I think we do have the opportunity to change the narrative, and we will. Thank you.